How inflation funds our governments. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Ainslie Insights, brought to you by Ainslie Bullion, Ainslie Crypto, and the Gold and Silver Standard. Today, welcome back Drew, who's been looking at something that we've all been talking about for a long time, inflation, how that impacts us individually, how that impacts countries, all of that together. How are you going today, Drew?
Good, Chris. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for coming back on. Now, I was talking about this recently with Sam about we knew when Trump came on the scene there was going to be a lot of news. Now he hasn't relented with the news cycle. It's constant at the moment. You're just always getting article after article or headline after headline. One such thing was his speeches at the World Economic Forum. That was really very interesting, particularly when he called for global interest rates to drop. And he said immediately, he said, I really think it needs to happen right now. This is a little bit unprecedented. Obviously, it's not completely unprecedented that you've got people like the president of the United States weighing in on what interest rates should be. But ultimately, they're not really, you would think, in a position to be able to dictate that. What's your take on this? What are the potential implications? How does this play out?
Well, it's a really interesting question because since the central bank started cutting interest rates in September last year, the bond yields have been rising as a response to price in a resurgence of inflation. So the bond market clearly thinks that we're not really ready to start cutting interest rates and go into looser monetary policy. We've got a populist president coming in, and he would, of course, want easy monetary policy to float markets, to reduce cost of living for mortgages. But inflation is probably something that's gonna come back in that situation. Now, the question is, does inflation actually benefit the government in the long term? And another interesting point is that if you look at the cycles for the DXY, the dollar index that's weighted against a basket of other currencies, it goes through these about 16-year cycles, and it is expected to fall off over the next 4 years, regardless of what's happening, just from a pure cyclical point of view. And if you look at the 18.6-year land cycle, we're actually entering the final phase of that as well, where asset prices are expected to move up exponentially, which would correlate with a falling dollar as well. So whether you look at cycles, you can expect the US dollar to fall off, or whether you look at government policy and what actually benefits them, you'd expect the US dollar to fall off temporarily, which would be a result of looser monetary policy. But really, what that leads to in the long run, which is something that's been building up since we got off the gold standard, really in the 70s, the early 70s, is inflation is just going to get worse and worse as we move forward.
The US dollar is so interesting to talk about here because when you look at what you've talked about, those cycles and what we would be expecting to happen technically, sort of looking, when I say technically, I mean that technical analysis sort of backdrop, that seems to be a little different from the rhetoric you're hearing from a lot of people around these policies that Trump's implementing that ultimately should be very dollar positive, because you can make an argument that things like tariffs, he's suggesting things like other growth policies that he's talking about implementing will attract more dollars into the US and ultimately lead to a stronger dollar. But you quite consistently have been arguing that probably the technicals overrun that here. Is that still your view? Do you still think that ultimately we end up following that cycle because there's bigger factors at play beyond what one president can do, even if that president is President Trump?
100%. I mean, I think there are a few factors that affect inflation. There's productivity, supply factors, free trade agreements, and things like that that would certainly play a part in it. But at the end of the day, inflation is just too many dollars chasing too few goods. So if you increase the dollar supply, it's really the major factor that will play a role in the individual currency units losing value. So if they're going to have looser monetary policy, which I think he will, and he might do that in parallel with tariffs, I really think that the looser monetary policy is going to override the long-term effects. In the long run, you might see tariffs not really be as influential as looser monetary policy. So in the short term, you might see a reaction to the tariffs. It might be something that lasts a couple of years, but really in the long run, increasing the monetary supply, increasing the currency supply, will definitely result in inflation. And we've seen that time and time again.
So that's all quite interesting. But if you think about bringing that conversation around to where we end up in terms of debt, because obviously we've got that inflation story that you're talking about. I mean, that's going to be, as you're describing, going to be an issue over the long term. But if you think about last year, the US government paid well over $1 billion in interest on its debt. And that was the first year it passed the defense budget, which was at 841 billion. So we're talking very large numbers. How does inflation play a role in managing that level of debt? Because if you're identifying that inflation is going to be an ongoing problem, how do we address that here? What's the approach that they can use to get that under control potentially?
Yeah, really interesting to relate inflation to government debt. And you say that inflation is an ongoing problem. Well, it might be an ongoing problem for hardworking everyday citizens, but it's actually an ongoing solution for a government that's drowning in debt. So when you've got the interest payments on, I think it's about $32 trillion of debt. Last year was about over, 1,000 billion or $1 trillion just in interest payments. And that's about, 1.3% the defense budget. That's not something that's sustainable, clearly. So over the long period, what a government will need to do is to somehow find a way to continue spending without raising taxes too much and have their debt be manageable. And the way they do this is by reducing the real value of the debt. The debt is denominated in the currency. So as your purchasing power reduces and as the value of your savings reduces, the real value of the government debt is reducing in parallel as well. And increasing taxes is political suicide. Cutting spending is political suicide. So they found a way to impose a hidden tax on the hardworking citizens that helps fund and fuel their spending addiction and allows them to continue without actually going bankrupt.
I'd want to elaborate on that a little bit more because you've mentioned this before, this concept of stealing from hardworking people that or inflation being a hidden tax. I don't know that people fully understand that. I know that they feel it, but I don't know that they understand the mechanics because when you talk about inflation being high, being good for the government, that's ultimately because that debt is smaller as a result. So do you want to maybe just elaborate a little bit more on what that means for people? Because where I'm going with this is the tie-in we have between thinking about that and gold, for example. I mean, that's something obviously we're bullion dealers. We think about gold all the time as a potential antidote for that. So can you maybe talk about that a little bit more and then potentially lead into how you view gold and silver as well, for that matter, as a potential solution?
Definitely. I think to really dig into the mechanics of this, we can bring interest rates into the conversation again. So if you look at the rate of inflation over a long period of time, the cash rate set by the central bank essentially over a long period needs to be lower than the inflation rate for the government to stay solvent. Because the cash rate set by the central banks, it affects not only the interest that you and I will earn in our savings deposits, but it actually affects the rate of interest that government will pay on their debt. So if they're paying a rate of interest that's higher than the rate at which the debt is devalued, they'll go broke. And that's great for governments. They've worked it out. But what does that mean for the individuals is that over a long period of time, the inflation rate, the real inflation rate that people are going to feel will be lower than the rate of interest that they earn on their savings deposits. So someone might be doing the right thing, working really hard, saving really diligently, and earning 3.3%, over the last 20 years on their term deposits, when the inflation rate's sitting at closer to 4.8% on average over the last 20 years. So they're losing over a percentage of, real purchasing power annually every year, not to mention that they're paying income tax on the interest earned on those savings as well. So what that means over the long term in terms of, well, how do you, if you're doing everything quote unquote right and you're still becoming poorer in real terms over the long term, just so that you can fund your government's spending and reduce the value of their debt. Well, what's the solution to that? If you look at hard assets, just take gold, for example, in this situation. Gold, on average, over the last 20 years, has yielded a growth of 10.5% per year. Now, that's well and truly outperformed or outpaced consumer inflation. And that's where things like asset inflation really come into the picture. Because when you've got an increase in money supply, all of this additional money in the system needs to find a home, needs to go somewhere. So it finds a home in places like land, gold, hard assets that have limited supply. So you've got an unlimited supply of currency that will find its home in a asset of limited supply, which means the dollar value of these assets will shoot up. It'll outperform consumer inflation, and it'll keep pace with essentially what we call asset inflation. And the difference between asset inflation and consumer inflation is essentially a representation of the wealth gap. And we can pull up a chart of this as well, but you'll see assets like gold have essentially kept pace with the increase in money supply. And there's a huge gap between CPI, consumer price inflation, which is what the day-to-day person's dealing with, and asset inflation, which is what, quote unquote, wealthy people are holding assets. And in real terms, they're getting wealthier every year. And that gap is just increasing exponentially. So the solution is to hold hard assets. And to dig into the mechanics of it, I mean, if you look at the long-term effects of holding something that's yielding 10.5% on compounding growth over 20, 30, 40 years, compared to something that's yielding 3.3%, our minds work in linear ways. Wrapping our heads around exponential and compounding growth, it's not something that comes naturally to us. But when you start crunching the numbers, I think Einstein said compounding is the eighth wonder of the world, and it's very, very true. I mean, the numbers are extremely compelling. So if you look at saving in gold versus saving in a term deposit over 20, 30 years, over someone's working career, the difference is in the millions of dollars. And there's an article that we can link to in this as well, or we can pull up a quick number, a quick chart for people to look at, a quick table for people to look at, and they can pause the video here if they really want to dig into the numbers, but just to see the staggering difference. So the idea is to not save in currency that's losing value, but save in hard assets like gold, which are gaining, keeping pace with asset inflation and outperforming consumer inflation, compounding over the long term, and you'll be well and truly okay.
And obviously, we try to keep these insight episodes to, talking about what's going on in the economy and not making them too much of a shill for products. But we do have that Ainslie Saver product that is really perfect for this. Do you want to just give us the quick rundown on that?
Absolutely. I mean, look, one way to save in gold is to come in once a month and buy, some physical gold and walk out with it, which is a bit more of an involved process. Something that's completely hands off that lends itself more to a dollar cost average approach, where you've picked an asset that you really like and you just average into it bit by bit consistently with discipline over the long term, over 10, 20, 30 years. That's when you can really take advantage of that compounding effect. And Ainslie Saver is set up for just that. You can have a direct direct deposit from your bank account to Ainslie, and that gets converted into a ratio between gold and silver. So you can choose what percentage of gold, whether it's 100% gold or 50-50 gold and silver. And periodically, whether that's weekly or monthly or whenever you're looking to make those periodic payments, it gets converted into the metals, and that just keeps building up over the years. So that's a very hands-off, relaxed approach. You don't need to make trips in and out and deal with physical metals, and that's really targeted at people for saving compared to saving in a bank deposit.
Look, worthwhile product and worthwhile discussion. You've talked about this multiple times, the impact that inflation plays, and I think it is something that people are getting their heads around, but it's a timely reminder always to be thinking about how that plays in the background, particularly with these new policies that we're talking about at the start, where we've got Trump coming in with things that potentially lead to more inflation. We don't really know the outcome of that. The US dollar, it's all complicated, but what's really simple is just trying to, we know an outcome always results in more inflation, and trying to protect yourself from that makes a lot of sense. So thank you for your work always on that, Drew.
Thanks so much, Chris. Great to chat to you.
Great to chat to you as well. Thanks everyone for watching. We'll chat again soon.